Kicking Wolf had killed the 17 geldings in a barren gully. The butchering had been hasty. Though the best meat had been taken, much was left. The rocks in the gully were pink with frozen blood. The carcasses all had ice on their hides. Augustus saw one horse who had ice covering its eyes, a sight that made his stomach rise. Guts had been pulled out and chopped up. Those left had frozen into icy coils. Buzzards wheeled in the cold sky. "I thought I was hungry a minute ago," Augustus said, "but now that I've seen this, I couldn't eat for $1." Many of the men were dead asleep, slumped wherever they had stopped. Captain Skull sat on a hummock of dirt staring toward the west. Now and then he spat tobacco juice on the sleety ground. "I can eat," Call said. "It won't cost nobody $1 either. I've seen the day when you didn't turn up your nose at horse meat, I recall." "That was a warmer day," Gus commented. "It's too early to be looking at this many butchered horses." "Be glad it ain't butchered men," Call said. Dietz, the black cook, seemed to be the only man in the outfit who could muster a cheerful look. He had a stew pot bubbling already and was slicing potatoes into it when they rode up. "If Dietz can make that horse meat tasty, I might sample a little," Augustus said. At the sight of the bubbling pot, he felt his appetite returning. Long Bill Coleman had his feet practically in the fire, his favorite posture when camped on a cold patrol. He had fallen asleep and was snoring loudly, oblivious to the fact that the soles of his boots were beginning to smoke. "Pull him back, Dietz. His feet are about to catch fire," Augustus said. "The fool will sleep with his feet amid the coals." Dietz pulled Long Bill a yard or two back from the fire, then offered them coffee, which they took gratefully. "Why'd you let all these boys nod off, Dietz?" Gus said. "Old Buffalo Hump might come down on us at any minute. They best be watching their hair." "Let 'em nap. They ridden for 2 days," Call said. "They'll wake up quick enough if there's fighting." Dietz took a big tin cup full of coffee over to Captain Skull, who accepted it without looking around. The captain's mouth was moving, but whatever he was saying got lost on the wind. "Old Nails is talking to himself again," Augustus observed. "Probably cussing that feisty wife of his for spending money. They say she spends $25 every day of the week." Call didn't think the captain was cussing his wife, not on a bald knob of the prairie icy with sleet. If he was cussing anybody, it was probably Kicking Wolf, who had escaped to the Rio Pecos with 3 fine stallions. "What was he saying, Dietz?" he asked when the black man came back and began to stir the stew. Dietz did not much like reporting on the captain. He might get the talk wrong and cause trouble. But Mr. Call had been good to him, giving him an old ragged quilt, which was all he had to cover with on the cold journey. Mr. Call didn't grab food like some of the others, or cuss him if the biscuits didn't rise quick enough to suit him. "He's talking about that one who shot him down Mexico," Dietz said. "What? He's talking about Ahumado?" Call asked, surprised. "Talking about him some," Dietz admitted. "I consider that peculiar information," Augustus said. "We're halfway to Canada chasing Comanches. What's Ahumado got to do with it?" "He don't like it that Ahumado shot his horse," Call said, noting that some of the men around the campfire were so sound asleep they looked as if they were dead. Most of them were sprawled out with their mouths open, oblivious to the wind and the icy ground. They didn't look as if they would be capable of putting up much resistance. But Call knew they would fight hard if attacked. The only man he was anxious about on that score was young P.I. Parker, a gangly boy who had only been allotted an old musket. Call didn't trust the gun and hoped to see that the boy got a repeating rifle before their next expedition. P.I. sat so far back from the campfire that he got little succor from it. He was poorly dressed and shivering, yet he had kept up through the long night and had not complained. "If you pulled in a little closer to the campfire, you'd be warmer," Call suggested. "It's my first trip. I don't guess I ought to take up too much of the fire," P.I. said. Then he swiveled his long neck around and surveyed their prospects. "I was raised amid trees and brush," he said. "I never expected to be no place where it was this empty." "It ain't empty. There's plenty of Comanches down in that big canyon," Augustus informed him. "Buffalo Hump's down there. Once we finally whip him, there won't be nothing but a few Chigger Indians to fight." "How do you know we'll whip him?" Call said. "It's bad luck to talk like that. We've been fighting him for years and we ain't come close to licking him yet." Before Augustus could respond, Captain Skull abruptly left the hummock where he'd been sitting and stomped back into camp. "Is that stew ready? This is a damn long halt," he said. Then he glanced at Call and got a surprised look on his face. "I thought Famous Shoes was with you, Mr. Call," Skull said. "I had no reason to suspect that he wasn't with you, but I'll be damned if I can spot him. It might be the glare off the sleet." "No, sir, he's not with me," Call said. "Damn it, why not?" Captain Skull asked. "If he's not with you, you'll just have to go fetch him. We'll save you some of the stew." "Sir, I don't know if I can fetch him," Call said. "He went to visit his grandmother. I believe she lives on the Washita, but he didn't say where exactly." "Of course you can fetch him. Why shouldn't you?" Skull asked with an annoyed look on his face. "You're mounted and he's afoot." "Yes, but he's a swift walker and I'm a poor tracker," Call admitted. "I might be able to track him, but it would be chancy." "What a damned nuisance. The man's gone off just when we need him most," Einish Skull said. He tugged at his peppery gray beard in a vexed fashion. When a fit of anger took him, he grew red above his whiskers, and as all of the men knew, he was apt to grow angry if offered the slightest delay. Call didn't say it, but he found the captain's comment peculiar. After all, Famous Shoes had been off ever since they crossed the Prairie Dog Fork of the Brazos. The scout wandered at will, returning only occasionally to parley a bit with the captain as he just had that morning. Based on past behavior, Captain Skull had no reason to expect to hear from Famous Shoes for a day or two more, by which time the scout could have visited his grandmother and returned. It was impatient and unreasonable behavior in Call's view. But then that seemed to be the way of captains, at least the ones he had served. They were impatient to a fault. If they didn't get a fight one place, they would turn and seek a fight somewhere else, no matter what the men felt about it or what condition they were in. They had missed Kicking Wolf, so now, if Dietz was right, the captain's thoughts had fixed on Ahumado, a Mexican bandit hundreds of miles to the south, and a marauder every bit as capable as Kicking Wolf or Buffalo Hump. Still, Call had never disobeyed an order, or complained about one either. It was Gus McCrae who grumbled about orders, though usually he was circumspect about who he grumbled to. Call knew that if the captain really wanted him to go after Famous Shoes, he would at least have to try. Call felt lank. He thought he'd better quickly gulp down a plate of stew before he went off on a pursuit that might take days. Captain Skull, though, did not immediately press the order. He stood with his back to the fire, swishing the remains of his coffee around in his cup. He looked at the sky, he looked at the horses, he looked south. Call held his peace. The muttering about Ahumado might only have been a momentary fancy that the captain, once he had assessed the situation, would reject. The captain sighed, gulped down the rest of his coffee, held out the cup for Dietz to refill, and looked at Call again. "I got short shrift from my grandmothers," he remarked. "One of them had 10 children, and the other accounted for 14. They were tired of brats by the time I came along. How long do you think Famous Shoes planned to visit?" "Sir, I have no idea," Call admitted. He wasn't even sure his grandmother still lived on the Washita. Or if you don't locate her, I expect he'll be back tomorrow. "Unless he thinks of somebody else to visit," Augustus said. Call hastily got himself a plate of stew. He felt he had been a little derelict in hesitating to set off immediately in pursuit of Famous Shoes. After all, the man could scarcely be more than 5 miles away. With reasonable luck, he ought to be able to overtake him. It was only the featurelessness of the plains that worried him. He might ride within a mile of Famous Shoes and still miss him because of the dips and slantings of the prairie. Now he felt like he ought to be ready to leave if that was what the captain wanted. "Taters ain't cooked yet," Dietz informed him as he dished up the stew. "That meat mostly raw, too." "I don't care, it'll fill me," Call said. "If you'd like me to go look for him, Captain, I will." Einish Skull didn't respond. Indeed, he gave no indication that he had even heard Woodrow call. Captain Skull was often casual, if not indifferent, in that way, a fact which vexed Augustus McCrae terribly. Here Woodrow, who was as cold and hungry as the rest of them, was offering to go off and run the risk of getting scalped, and the captain didn't even have the good manners to answer him. It made Gus burn with indignation, though it also annoyed him that Call would be so quick to offer himself for what was clearly a foolish duty. Famous shoes would turn up in a day or two whether anybody looked for 'em or not. "I was thinking of Mexico, Mr. Call," Captain Skull said finally. "I see no point in pursuing Kicking Wolf for the sake of 3 horses. We'll corner the man sooner or later, or if we don't get him, the smallpox will." "What? The smallpox?" Augustus said. He had a big nervousness about diseases, the various poxes particularly. "Yes, it's traveling this way," Einish Skull said impatiently, his mind being now on Mexico. "The theory is that the 49ers spread it among the red men as they were running out to California to look for gold," he added. "Very damn few of them will find any of the precious ore, but they've brought the pox to the prairies, I guess. The Indians along the Santa Fe Trail have it bad, and I hear that those along the Oregon Trail are dying by the hundreds. It'll be among the Comanches soon, if it ain't already. Once the pox gets among them, they'll die off so quick we'll probably have to disband the Rangers. There'll be no healthy Indians left to fight." Captain Skull finished his speech and lifted his coffee cup. But before he could sip, a peppering of gunfire swept the camp. "It's Buffalo Hump, I knowed it," Augustus said. Call had only gulped down a few bites of stew when the shooting started. He ran back to his horse and pulled out his rifle, expecting the Indians to be upon them. But when he turned, the prairie looked empty. Most of the Rangers had taken cover behind their horses, there being no other cover to take. Captain Skull had drawn his big pistol, but had not moved from his spot by the coffee pot. He had his head tilted slightly to one side, watchful and curious. "We just lost Watson," he said, examining the camp. "Either that or he's enjoying a mighty heavy nap." Augustus ran over and knelt by Jimmy Watson, a man a year or 2 older than himself and Call. At first he saw no wound and thought the captain might be right about the heavy nap. But when he turned Jimmy Watson slightly, he saw that a bullet had got him right under his armpit. He must have been lifting his gun, and the bullet passed just beneath it and killed him. "Nope, Jim's dead," Gus said. "I wish the damn Comanches would stand up so we could see 'em." "Wish for Christmas and roast pig while you're wishing," Call said. "They ain't going to stand up." Then, a moment later, 5 young warriors appeared horseback a considerable distance from the camp. They were yelling and whooping, but they weren't attacking. The lead horseman was a tall youth whose hair streamed out behind him as he raced his pony. Several of the Rangers lifted their rifles, but no one fired a shot. The Comanches had gauged the distance nicely, and they were already just out of rifle range. Call watched Captain Skull, waiting for him to give the order to mount and pursue. The captain had taken out his binoculars and was studying the racing horsemen. "I was looking for brands on the horses," he said. "I was hoping our Abilene ponies might be there, but no luck. They're just Comanche ponies." All the Rangers stood by their horses, waiting for the order to pursue the Comanches. But Captain Skull merely stood watching the 5 young warriors race away, as casual as if he'd been watching a Sunday horse race. "Captain, ain't we going to chase 'em? They killed Jimmy Watson," Augustus asked, puzzled by the captain's casual attitude. "No, we'll not chase 'em, not on tired horses," the captain said. "Those are just the pups. The old he-wolf is down there somewhere, waiting. I doubt those youngsters expected to hit anybody when they shot. They were just trying to lure us down into some box canyon where the he-wolf can cut us off and tear out our throats." He turned and put his binoculars back in their leather case. "I'd prefer to wait for that stew to mature and then take breakfast," he said. "If the old he-wolf wants us bad enough, let him come. We'll oblige him with a damn good scrap, and when it's over, I'll take his hide back to Austin and nail it to the governor's door." "Sir, what'll we do with Jimmy?" Long Bill asked. "This ground's froze hard. It'll take a good strong pick to hack out a grave in ground like this, and we ain't got a pick." Captain Skull came over and looked at the dead man. He knelt, rolled the man over, and inspected the fatal wound. "There's no remedy for bad luck, is there?" he said, addressing the question to no one in particular. "If Watson hadn't raised his arm just when he did, the worst he would have gotten out of this episode would have been a broken arm. But he lifted his gun, and the bullet had a clear path to his vitals. I'll miss the man. He was someone to talk wives with." "What, sir?" Augustus asked. The remark startled him. "Wives, Mr. McCrae," Einish Skull said. "You're a bachelor. I doubt you can appreciate the fascination of the subject. But James Watson appreciated it. He was on his third wife when he had the misfortune to catch his dying. He and I could talk wives for hours. "Well, but what happened to his wives?" Long Bill inquired. "I'm a married man. I'd like to know." "One died, one survives him, and the one in the middle ran off with an acrobat," the captain said. "That's about average for wives, I expect. You'll find that out soon enough, Mr. McCrae, if you take it into your head to marry." Augustus was thoroughly sorry that the subject of marriage had come up. It seemed to him that he had been trying to get married for half his life. He had just happened, unluckily, to fall in love with the one woman who wouldn't have him. "Sir, even if one of his wives did run off with an acrobat, we've still got to bury him some way," Long Bill said. Once Long Bill got his mind on something, he rarely allowed it to be deflected until the question at hand was closed. Now the question at hand was how to bury a man when the ground was too frozen to yield them a grave. When Jimmy Watson had been alive, he needed wives, apparently, and it was a need Long Bill understood and sympathized with. But now he was dead. What he needed was a grave. "Well, I suppose we do need to bury James Watson. That's the Christian way," the captain said. "It was not the way taken by my cousin Willie, though. Cousin Willie was a biologist. He studied with Professor Agassiz at Harvard. Willie was particularly fond of beetles, excessively fond, some might say. He fancied tropical beetles in particular. Professor Agassiz took him to Brazil, where there are some wonderful beetles. More beetles than any place in the world, except Madagascar, Willie claimed. They've even got an undertaker beetle down there in Brazil." "What kind?" Augustus asked. He had vaguely heard of Brazil, but he had never heard of an undertaker beetle. "An undertaker beetle, sir," Captain Skull went on. "Willie wanted to go back into the food chain the fastest way possible, and the fastest way was to have himself laid out naked in a tidy spot where these undertaker beetles were plentiful. So that's what they did with Will," the captain continued. "They had no choice. Willie had fixed it all in his will. They laid him out naked in a pretty spot, and the beetles immediately got to work. Pretty soon Willie was buried, and by the next day he was part of the food chain again, just as he wished. If we left James Watson to the coyotes and the buzzards, we'd be accomplishing the same thing." Long Bill Coleman was horrified by such talk. He was unfamiliar with Brazil, and the thought of being buried by beetles gave him the shudders. Not only was the captain forgetting about Jimmy Watson's widow, whose feelings about the burial had to be considered, he was even forgetting about heaven. "Now then, that's strange talk," he said. "How would a man get up to heaven with no one saying any scriptures over him and with just a darn bunch of beetles for undertakers? Of course, out here in the Baldies, we can't expect undertakers, but I guess I'll try to bury my pards myself. I wouldn't trust the job to a bunch of darn bugs." "My cousin Willie was of an agnostical bent, Mr. Coleman," the captain said. "I don't think he believed in heaven, but he did believe in bugs. They're not to be underrated, sir, not according to my cousin Willie. There are more than 1 million species of insects, Mr. Coleman, and they're a sight more adaptable than us. I expect there will be bugs aplenty when we humans are all gone." Young P.I. Parker was so hungry he found it hard to pay attention to the conversation. For one thing, he couldn't figure out what a food chain could be, unless the captain was talking about link sausage. How a beetle in a country he had never heard of could turn a dead man into link sausage was beyond his ken. Dietz's stew pot was bubbling furiously. Now and then a good odor drifted his way. His only opinion was that he himself did not intend to be buried naked. It would be a hard shock to his maw if he came walking into heaven without a stitch. Dietz, stirring the stew, did not like to be discussing dead folks so boldly. For all they knew, the dead could still hear. Just because the lungs stopped working didn't mean the hearing stopped too. The dead person could still be in there listening, and if a dead person was to hear bad things said about him, he might witch you. Dietz had no desire to be witched. When it became necessary to make some comment about a dead person, he made sure his comment was respectful. Call was vexed. He was prepared to go fight the Comanches who had just killed Jimmy Watson. If the Rangers had pressed the pursuit at once, they might have got close enough to bring down a Comanche or two. He didn't think Buffalo Hump was waiting to ambush them. To him it just looked like a party of 5 young braves hoping to count coup on the white men, and they had counted coup. How could the captain stand around talking about beetles when one of their men had been killed? Augustus knew what his friend was feeling. He himself felt exactly the same thing. The Comanches had killed a Texas Ranger and got away clean. Behavior such as that would soon make the Rangers the laughing stock of the prairies. And yet Captain Skull's reputation as a deadly and determined fighter was well earned. He and Call had often seen the captain deal out slaughter. What was wrong with him this morning? Captain Skull suddenly looked at the two young rangers, a trace of a smile on his lips. His look, as was often the case, made both men feel that he could read their minds. "Why, do I smell discontent? I believe I catch a whiff of it," the captain said. "What's the matter, Mr. Call? Afraid I've lost my vinegar?" "Why, no, sir," Call said, truthfully. Despite his pique, he had not supposed that Captain Skull had lost his fight. What he felt was that the captain, as a commander, was changeable in ways he didn't understand. "I would have liked to punish those braves while we still had a chance to catch them," Call added. "That was my thought, too," Augustus said. "They killed Jimmy Watson, and he was a mighty fine fella." "That he was, Mr. McCrae, that he was," Captain Skull said. "Normally I would have given chase myself, but this morning I'm not in the mood for it. Not right this minute, at least." Inish Skull went to his saddlebags and took out the huge brown plug of tobacco he cut his chaws from. He had a special little knife with a mother-of-pearl handle just for cutting his tobacco. He was so fearful of losing his little knife that he kept it attached to his belt by a thin silver chain, such as he might use on a pocket watch. The captain took out his knife, found a place not far from the fire, and began to cut himself a day's worth of chaws, working carefully. He liked to make each chaw as close to square as possible. Often, once the captain had cut off a chaw, he would hold it up for inspection and trim it a little more, removing a sliver here and a sliver there to make it a little closer to square. "I believe our stew's about ready, Dietz," he said, once he had restored the big brownish plug to his saddlebag. "Let's eat. I might recover my chasing mood once I've sampled the grub." "Ever work in an office, Mr. Call?" he then inquired, as the men lined up with their tin plates to get their stew. Call was startled. Why would the captain suppose he had ever worked in an office, when the records plainly showed that he had been employed as a Texas Ranger from the age of 19? "No, sir, I've worked outside my whole life," Call said. "Well, I have worked in an office, sir," the captain said. "It was the customs house in Brooklyn, and I was sent to work there by my pa in the hope of breaking me of certain bad habits. I worked there for a year and did the same thing in the same way every day. I arrived at the same time, left at the same time, took my sip of wine and bite of bread at the same time. I even pissed and shat at the same time. I was a regular automaton while I held that office job, and I was bored, sir, bored, intolerably bored." Inish Skull's face reddened suddenly at the memory of his own boredom in the office in Brooklyn. He neatly stacked up his 10 squares of cut tobacco and looked at Call. "The tragedy of man is not death or epidemic or lust or rage or fitful jealousy," he said loudly. His voice tended to rise while declaiming unpleasant facts. "No, sir, the tragedy of man is boredom, sir. Boredom," the captain said. "A man can only do a given thing so many times with freshness and spirit. Then, no matter what it is, it becomes like an office task. I enjoy cards and whoring, but even cards and whoring can grow boresome. You tup your wife 1,000 times, and that becomes an office task, too." Skull paused to see if the hard truths he was expounding were having any effect on his listeners, and found that they were. All the men were listening, with the exception of an old fellow named Ike Ripple, who had gulped a little stew and fallen back to sleep. "You see," the captain said, "Mr. Ike Ripple is bored even now, even though Buffalo Hump could show up any minute and lift his hair. Now that's my point, sir," he said, looking directly at Call. "I will break the resistance of the goddamn Red Comanches on these plains, given the time and the resources, but I'll be damned if I'll jump up and chase every Indian brat that fires a gun off at me. Do that and it becomes office work. Do you get my point, Mr. Call?" Call thought he got the point, but he wasn't sure he agreed with it. Fighting Indians meant risking your life. How many men in offices had to risk their lives? "Why, yes, Captain, I believe I do," Call said mildly. After all, the captain was older. He had survived more Indian fights than any man on the frontier. Perhaps they had grown boresome to him. Captain, you never said how your cousin died, that one that got buried by the beetles," Long Bill remarked. The details of the unorthodox burial had been preying on his mind. He was curious as to what sort of death had led up to it. "Oh, Cousin Willie, why, snakebite," the captain said. "Willie was bitten by a fer de lance, one of the deadliest snakes in the world. He had begun to stuff the square-cut plugs of tobacco into his coat pocket for use during the day. "He was a scientist to the end, our William," he went on. "He timed his own death, you know. Timed it with a stopwatch." "Timed it? But why, sir?" Gus asked. "If I was dying of snakebite, I doubt I'd get out my watch." "Oh, then what would you do, Mr. McCrae?" the captain asked in a pleasant tone. Augustus thought of Clara Forsythe, so fetching with her curls and her frank smile. "I believe I'd just scrawl off a letter to my girl," Gus said. "I'd be wanting to bid her goodbye, I expect." "Why, that's fine. That's the human instinct," Captain Skull said. "You're a romantic fella, I see. So was our Willie in his way, only he was romantic about science. Professor Agassiz taught him to never waste an experience, and he didn't. The average time of death from the bite of a fer-de-lance is 20 minutes. I expect Willie hoped to improve on the average, but he didn't. He died in 17 minutes 34 seconds. Give or take a second or two." Captain Skull stood up and looked across the gray plain. "Willie was alone when he was bitten," the captain said. "His stopwatch was in his hand when they found him. 17 minutes and 34 seconds he lived. Now that's bravery, I'd say." "I'd say so too, Captain," Call said, thinking about it.